honor. And in the revelation of Jesus, we have been told that though what we will be has not yet been revealed, what we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. So we pray today that in reflection of Jesus' last words of his struggle with flesh and blood, we see a little bit more of him revealed so that we might learn more of who we are called to be in this world. In the way and power of his conviction, we pray. Amen. Now, as you will have likely noticed, these 7 last words of Jesus have been compiled from the 4 Gospels. Not every gospel includes all of these sayings. For example, according to John's gospel, Jesus' last words are, "It is finished." Whereas in Luke, Jesus uses his last breath to say, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And from conversations I've had, I know that when some people notice this variance, they're not sure how to interpret it. Jesus couldn't have said both at the same time. Did he say one before the other? That some people missed part of what he said? Why did one author record one saying and the other authors didn't? I used to ask questions like this when I imagined the scriptures as if they were like a documentary film unfolding frame by frame in linear fashion. However, over time, I learned to read the scriptures differently. I learned that scriptures were written to be heard, which is different than something being written to be read. In that time, very few people were literate and had traditions passed down to them orally. In general, people didn't interpret in the way that we do now. When they heard a story, they had likely heard it many times and filled in any blanks with the history that had already been embedded in their communal memory. When stories were shared, they were meant to tell the people something about who they were as a people, as well as their hopes and dreams. So what we see in the different last words of Jesus in the 4 Gospels is likely a reflection of what was important to the different communities for whom the scriptures were originally written. When we look at the Gospels together, what we're looking at is a library as opposed to a single volume. At the time of their writing, the communities that had their different Gospels, the ones that were written for, they didn't have 7 last words. They had 1, 2, or 3 last words, and those were the ones that they thought were relevant to their community. In Matthean and Markan communities, Jesus' last words were those of a person who felt forsaken. He had done all of his good with his life, and it hadn't been appreciated. These words were meant to point to Psalm 22, which begins with those confounding words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then ends triumphantly telling the hearers that it will be the future generations that actually get the message and what it was all about. In Luke, Jesus' last words pointed hearers to Psalm 31, and specifically verse 5, which communicates to the hearers that Jesus wasn't going to be destroyed by people's hate, but rather willingly went to his refuge, which was the abode of God's eternal heart. Now, the Jesus of the Lucan community is still in the power position even when dying on the cross. He forgives, he blesses, and then decides to give up his spirit and leave his body behind. Likewise, when he decides to get back in the body, he will do that without any permission from the earthly authorities. Lastly, the Johannine community uses the last words to convey that Jesus completed the transaction he came to fulfill. Where in John 19:28, Jesus says, "I thirst," in order to fulfill the scripture, is pointing the hearer to Psalm 63, communicating that God's love is better than life. This is yet another indication that Jesus knew what he was doing. And as he said in the same gospel, "No one takes it," meaning my life from me, "but I lay it down of my own accord." I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. Ultimately, what all these last word traditions communicate is that the last words we speak are a reflection of the life we live. As we reflect on these words this Good Friday, I invite you to consider the legacy of the last words you might leave to your communities, and how will they reflect on the life that you've lived. Ever since I was assigned these last words of Jesus, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," I've been saying them to myself on a daily basis. When I remember, I even say them to myself repeatedly as I fall asleep at night. As I say the words in my head, I try to imagine as far as I can what it might have been like for Jesus to say those words in that moment. It's been said that whenever we face death, our life passes before our mind's eye. We see everything that we've done or not done with complete clarity. For those of us who face death and live to tell the tale, such an experience can lead to a profound shift in how we experience life from that moment on. And they call that a near-death experience. And I actually had one when I was a teenager, and I can confess to you that what they say was true for me. My brothers and I had gotten in a car accident on the interstate coming back from Virginia Beach. And my mother was out of town, and she had told us not to go too far from home. So, like a good son, I did not listen. When a friend came in, he had access to his father's car, he invited us to take us to the beach. And initially I declined because I knew that my mom wouldn't approve. But after being called a party pooper by my brothers who said they would go with or without me, I agreed to go, thinking that as the oldest, allowing them to go without me was worse than me conspiring with them. And I knew my mother would be upset to learn that we went, but I thought she'd be even more upset if I let them go alone. So that justification was the first thing to go through my mind, and as the car began to swerve, right before we flipped and crashed into the only barrier that separated us from a 2-story or so fall. As it became evident that we were crashing, everything slowed down around me. The first thought I had was about how devastated my mother would be to discover that all 3 of her sons died in an accident that we should have never been in the first place. I also thought about how me being the oldest and not being able to make my brother stay at home would reflect on her and on me and our relationship. The next thought I had was about how this was the Friday before the first day of my senior year in high school, the first year I'd ever looked forward to, and now I was going to miss it. From there, I started looking backwards at my life, and I saw that there wasn't much to it. Even though I doubted that I would ever live past 18, I somehow thought I would have done more with the time I had, and it never even occurred to me that I might die in a car accident. Now, unless you've had a similar experience, I imagine it may be difficult to explain how I was experiencing time in this flipping vehicle. But basically, it was as if the car flipped for the entire 17 years that I had been alive, and was culminating in the accident that was going to end my life. And I wasn't afraid or anything. I was just disappointed. And yet there was this peace, or maybe you might call it an acceptance, and I saw that there was no need to resist. And that was it. I was dying this day. And at that proposition, I thought about what I believed to be my last words on earth. It wasn't anything noble like "into your hands I commit my spirit" or "it is finished." I didn't even think that I was forsaken. Nope. My last words were just, "Oh well." That was it. Oh well. How sad is that? For weeks after the accident, I kept thinking about what other thoughts I wish I had that would have occurred to me in what I thought were going to be my last moments. And this may sound pretty morbid, but this is when I first started imagining my death and trying to figure out what would be worthy last words. It didn't take long for me to realize that having the mindset to choose your last words has to be cultivated. In preparation for this message, I came across some commentaries that helped me imagine how those present at Jesus' crucifixion and those for whom these scriptures were originally written might have heard Jesus. One of the commentaries from Dr. Rachamin Melamed Cohen expressed that the message of Judaism is that one must struggle until the last breath of life. Until the last moment, one has to live and rejoice and give thanks to their Creator. Another commentator said, as the soul is leaving the body, a threefold call is heard, and it comes from heaven. And it's, "O son of Adam," or daughter, "hast thou abandoned the world, or has the world abandoned thee? Hast thou gathered of the world, or has the world gathered of thee? Hast thou slain the world, or has the world slain thee?" In this moment, the sound occasioned by the divorce of soul from body reaches from one end of the world to the other, but no one hears it, except for a rooster. Now, as an aside, we remember that after Peter denied Jesus 3 times, a rooster crowed 3 times. And I wonder if that's an allusion to the threefold call of heaven. But I digress. The point that I'm trying to make is that one cannot speak last words such as "into your hands I commit my spirit" in their last breaths unless they cultivated that relationship in the breaths prior. As another commentator reminds us, Jesus dies uttering words from a psalm of confidence, Psalm 31:5. And that psalm was often considered to be a prayer that one commended oneself into God's care during the night's sleep. As Jesus enters into the sleep of death, he takes a similar step of faith. His last words are a commentary not only on his death, but also on the life he lived. Now, I had another incident in life. I don't know what you call it, destiny, fate, kismet, I don't know what you call it. But I happened to be in Hawaii some years ago, right when there was going to be a tsunami. And I happened to run into a family of church people. And they happened to take me to their house. And it happened that 4 o'clock in the morning, I saw them preparing. And I said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "A tsunami is on the way." Very simply. And they were prepared and they were calm and they acted as if it was any other day because of the spirit they had cultivated in their everyday life. And they taught me this. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that word, aloha. And we think that it means hello and goodbye because that's how people typically use it. But what they taught me is the best way to understand it would to be "I love you." But really, essentially, the alo means presence. And the ha is the breath of life. And so when you encounter someone, you say aloha because you're honoring that the breath of life is present in that person and that your breath of life is present. Does that make sense? So beautiful. And that when we're present with that, it changes fundamentally our life, how we live it in the present and how we end it. He also shared with me that before Hawaii had been westernized, men and women used to greet each other by putting their foreheads together and breathing the air from their noses. That was the breath of life that they would exchange. And he said that they did this because we could always use the breath of our mouth to tell a lie, but the breath from our nose is always the truth. And that is the breath of life. And so I invite you, as you continue to breathe, to reflect on how you use your breath. In between the first breath and the last breath, and the words that you might use when you leave your breath behind. And as you leave space for that, I'd like to read a poem to you. It's called "Into Your Hands." Into your hands I commit my spirit, because I won't endure this lie. This prison system cannot be true, built on the illusion that we must die. Death's nothing more or less than a doorway, or when a movie changes scenes. Different characters embodying roles, but there's just one dreamer of these dreams. Yet somehow we've conceived to deny this, even though it makes no sense. In the beginning there was always one, and there only has been ever since. I struggle every day to express this, to live wholly in your call, knowing that I'm denying one if I can't see you in all. This is the fruit of religious life, bonding body and mind to soul, forsaking the separate self that never was, and abandoning false control. This is when the journey ends. We found the only thing worth finding, and teaching each other is no longer done. We simply trust in your reminding. God of eternity, in these present hours, conspire with us, that is, breathe with us, so that every action we take might be imbued with your spirit. As we continue to struggle with our every breath to learn more and more of you, remind us that our last breath and our last words are just as important as everything we've shared with this world. They are the enduring legacy that witnesses our lives, and the ones who watch it will never soon forget. In the Spirit of Christ we pray. Amen.